This CD contains a series of radio shows presented by Pastor Sheldon Emry. These programs were broadcast many years ago, so when you hear Pastor Emry mention books or packages available by mail, please understand that some of that material may no longer be available, and if you hear him give out a mailing address, it is incorrect. For a current catalog of literature and electronic media offered by America's Promise Ministries, please visit our website, where you will also find links to Pastor Dave Barley's YouTube video sermons and many other valuable resources. We invite you to explore www.amprom.org. That's AMPROM.org. Thank you.
We have been studying God's laws on money and economics and making a comparison between the divine system and our own money system. 2 points we have discussed is God's absolute forbiddance of the charging of interest on debts and the cancellation of debts every 7 years. To my new listeners, I must ask, please bear with me. I know any minister advocating interest-free money and cancellation of all unpaid debts at set times may sound strange to you, but perhaps the strangeness is not because the principles are wrong, but because you simply did not know that these were divine laws. Almost every American hears preaching during his lifetime. Many of you, if you listen to Christian radio broadcasts, hear hours and hours of preaching every week. But few of you ever hear a minister preach about money and debt, because it is hardly ever done in modern America. Many ministers do not even know that God gave definite laws on money and debts. I am not going to repeat our study so far, but for new listeners I will give chapter and verse. You can read them yourself, and then just stay tuned as we continue with other passages on the law and on prophecy. Interest on debts is forbidden in Exodus 22, verse 25, given at Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments. In Leviticus 25, verse 35 through 37, in Deuteronomy 23, verse 19 and 20, where God says rather plainly that blessings of prosperity for the nation depend upon that nation not charging interest on money to the people. In Psalm 15, the psalmist asked, "Who will dwell in God's holy hill?" And the answer, "He that putteth not out his money to usury, nor taketh reward against the innocent." Jeremiah and Ezekiel both declared righteousness included not charging usury or interest on money. Ezekiel 18 states that a usurer is to be put to death, and includes the usurer with the murderer for punishment. In my article on money in our February packet, I quote the words of the great German reformer Martin Luther, and Luther classed usury with murder in his teachings 500 years ago. In several places in the books of the prophets, chastisement and punishment were brought upon Israel by God because, quote, "Thou hast taken usury and increase, and thou hast greedily gained of thy neighbors by extortion." Ezekiel 22. We also saw that in Luke 19, Jesus Christ classified usury with thievery. He plainly labeled it stealing. On the law of cancellation of unpaid debts every 7 years, you can read that in Deuteronomy 15. It is also referred to in Leviticus 25, which is the chapter on the law of the Jubilee. We haven't discussed the law of Jubilee yet. God willing, we shall later. But first, while you are getting your Bibles to read with me, I will offer our February free literature. The February packet is the same as the January packet, and it contains 2 major items and some smaller tracts. The first is a 24-page booklet titled "Billions for the Bankers Brings Wars, Taxes, and Debts to the People," and it is about America's debt money system, which operates with all of the workers in debt to the bankers, so that a large percentage of all created wealth in the nation is paid from the workers to the bookkeepers who are called bankers. In America, this has progressed so far that the bankers carry debt paper on almost every acre of land and every building, with the total reaching $3 trillion, on which the bankers draw interest, or what is biblically called usury. This booklet explains our system, how the bankers create or obtain the money from the U.S. Treasury for the cost of the printing, then lend it to the borrower, who must pay for it in purchasing power of goods and services. Several pages in the booklet explain how a bank can create a $1,000 credit loan on an automobile at a cost to the banker of perhaps $1, and then draw $200 to $300 in charges over 2 or 3 years. Many workers and borrowers realize bankers become wealthy without producing any product and are taking title to land and buildings in the nation, but they don't understand how it is done. My booklet, Billions for the Bankers, explains it, complete with illustrations, so that even a 12-year-old child could understand the robbery. Write to me at America's Promise, Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona, 85010. Ask for the free February packet. There are several other items, also a list of our literature and books, and a list of Bible studies on cassette tapes. In the packet is information also on how you can obtain these radio broadcasts on tape mailed to your home. Just write to me, Pastor Emry, at America's Promise, Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona, 85010. I'll repeat that address later in the program. All right, back to God's laws on economics, on the subject of stable money. First, the general law, and then we'll read some of the specific statutes. The law was given at Mount Sinai. Exodus 20, verse 15, the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. And verse 17, the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and so on. These, of course, are the basic laws establishing the just right of property ownership, and the divine precept that taking property from another person is stealing and covetousness. Then some specific instructions were given at the same time. Exodus 21 covers such diverse areas as a man causing injury to another is to pay for his healing and time lost from work. A man causing a miscarriage is to pay the husband damages. Persons responsible for leaving pits uncovered or wild animals loose are to pay damages for people injured, and so on. Chapter 22 covers thieves who are to restore from double to 5 times the amount they stole, man's responsibility when he takes care of another person's property. Verse 20 and 22 orders the strangers, widows, or fatherless children are not to be afflicted or oppressed. Verse 25, interest is not to be charged on money, as we have seen that is a form of stealing, and so on. And let's face it, many crimes are a form of stealing. Killing is stealing a man's life, or a woman's husband, or a child's father. Raping is stealing a woman's virginity and her honor. Bearing false witness or tale-bearing steals a man's reputation or results in other loss to him. Covetousness often leads to stealing, and on and on. So someone is ready to ask, what has all of that to do with stable money? Well, some people, especially you older folks, are finally realizing that inflating and deflating the purchasing power of money is a very effective method of stealing, without the thief having to risk using a gun to do it. One simple example of how inflation steals is that it has moved many people into higher income tax brackets. They have not gained purchasing power, but the government now takes a larger percentage of their earnings, stealing it, as it were, by deceit and fraud. And we'll discuss more of that later. I mentioned the year of Jubilee, or the law of Jubilee, and I will cover that later, but I think right now we should discuss some Bible passages on gold and silver, and also some history on gold, for there is much controversy among so-called economists as to the function of gold in relation to money, and the church seems to have no answer or advice. Many who will admit the evil of usury, or interest on debt, still insist that money should consist of valuable metal, or at the very least be redeemable in silver or gold. History proves, however, that it is the stability and honesty of the government which gives value to its money, not some arbitrary amount of metal buried in some hole in the ground. The Bible has much to say about gold, and it is mostly bad. Israel's first transgression at Mount Sinai was in turning from God to make an idol of gold which they worshipped. In Deuteronomy 7 and verse 25, Israel was warned not to covet the gold and silver of the Canaanites, quote, "lest thou be snared therein, for it is an abomination to the Lord thy God." In Deuteronomy 17, verse 17, the ruler of the nation was warned not to multiply to himself silver and gold. In Joshua 7, a man in Israel stole some Canaanite gold and a Babylonish garment and buried them under his tent. God considered it a sin so great, he allowed Israel's armies to be defeated by the Canaanites until Joshua searched out the camp and destroyed the gold and the man himself. I covered that episode in my series on Esau some months ago, so I'll not repeat it here, but that chapter is a condemnation of the economic system of Babylon, which was based on gold and usury. As many students of Bible prophecy know, the mystery Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18, that evil, antichrist, world-ruling power, counted gold the most precious commodity of trade, according to Revelation 18 and verse 12. So, if Mystery Babylon covets and exalts gold, we Christians had better be careful about what we do with gold in a Christian republic such as America. In the books of the law, we find that there were such things as gold coins. In fact, Abraham purchased things with gold coins, but the main use for gold was in the vessels of the tabernacle and as inlays in the wood and other items of worship. There is no scriptural foundation for the use of gold as backing for money or debt. In fact, the Bible and secular history reveal that the most prosperous and happy kingdom of the pre-Christian era was that of wise King Solomon. And I wonder how many present-day economists know how Solomon handled gold. Well, the Bible tells us what Solomon did with gold and silver. In 2 Chronicles 1, we are told that God gave Solomon great wisdom. And we read in verse 15, and that is 2 Chronicles 1, verse 15. You students of money and the Bible, write this down. Quote, "And the king made silver and gold at Jerusalem as plenteous as stones." And the italics show the words "as plenteous" were not in the oldest text, so it should read that Solomon made silver and gold as stones. Not much value in stones, is there? Not many men, no matter how evil, would kill to obtain something that was considered as worthless as stones. In the chapters which follow, we find they used gold on chariots, on shields, and on all sorts of furnishings of the temple and the palace. Much of it was on items which could easily be stolen if the gold were of any value, which obviously it was not. In chapter 9, we see that silver was accounted of even less value. In verse 20, it tells us the drinking vessels were all of gold, that none were of silver, because, quote, it was not anything accounted of in the days of Solomon. Can you imagine that? The nation and the people were peaceful and prosperous above all other kingdoms, and yet silver and gold were accounted almost worthless. Is our economic system turned upside down? We have gold at the top. Solomon had it at the bottom. And we are not only losing our supposed prosperity, but we are in danger of losing what little peace we have. Between the red Asiatics preparing war against us on the outside, and the red spies subverting us on the inside, and the Indians claiming our land and our water, and aliens coming in and occupying our houses and taking our jobs, perhaps it is time to look at the fundamental base of our system. Is it scriptural? Is it according to Bible law? What is wrong in America anyway? There are many other references to gold in the Bible which make it obvious that no nation wishing to prosper and to be blessed of God dare place a high value on gold. In the vision of King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2, the head of the succession of beast or antichrist empires was of gold. Since it is the head which controls any body, whether it is man or beast, God was showing us that gold would be the mechanism of rule in the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greek, and Roman succession of beast empires, just as Revelation 18:12 tells us that gold was the most precious item in Mystery Babylon. Today the world places great hope and trust in gold and other precious metals such as silver. But God tells us through the prophet Isaiah of the end of this age. In chapter 2 and verse 12, God calls it the day of the Lord of hosts. And in verse 19, he says it is the day when God ariseth to shake terribly the earth. And what will men do with gold and silver in that day? Verse 20, Isaiah 2, in that day a man shall cast his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made each one for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats. It will be worthless. Ezekiel prophesies much the same. Ezekiel 7, God speaks of judgment upon Israel for disobedience, and we read in verse 17, all hands shall be feeble and all knees shall be weak as water. Putting it another way, a time of exceeding great fear. Verse 19, they shall cast their silver in the streets, and their gold shall be removed. Or as the margin says, their gold shall be uncleanness. Their gold shall be removed. Their silver and their gold shall not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. And there is that phrase which identifies that as the last days, in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels, because it is the stumbling block of their iniquity. And I think the margin translation on that last phrase is probably better. It says, they shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels, because their iniquity is their stumbling block. In other words, gold and silver will not even be able to buy food for them to fill their bowels, because their problem is sin. Their stumbling block is transgression of God's law, and God will see to it that gold and silver will be of no use in that day. There is much more in the Bible about gold, but that should be sufficient to prove that God looks with disfavor on those who trust in gold and silver for prosperity. I have studied the biblical use of gold, and I want to make it clear that Pastor Emry does not advocate gold-backed money, or any sort of paper money, redeemable in gold as a means of solving our economic dilemma. Our problem is not gold or lack of gold anyway. Our national problems are a direct consequence of our sin against God, or the transgression of God's laws, especially in the realm of debt and interest. How about history? Does it have any lesson for us on gold? Although some of the banker propagandists try to fool us into thinking we either have gold or that we need gold, any rudimentary knowledge of history itself proves them wrong. From the 16th century to the 18th century, Spain hauled ships full of gold and silver from Central and South America to Spain, and was at the height of her military power. Her navy ruled the seas, and her future was considered so great that the Roman Pope himself divided the world into two parts and gave Spain the Western Hemisphere. But while that was being done, the English also came to the New World, and instead of finding gold, they found good soil and climate, and planted crops and built buildings and towns. By 1850, Spain had lost or sold her empire, and the English colonies, which had dug in the soil to plant seeds, instead of digging for gold, had become the fastest-growing nation in wealth and power in the world. The final irony of the golden empire of Spain came in 1898, when the young nation of America, with her prosperity founded on agriculture and industry, swept the last of the Spanish fleet from the seas in Cuba and the Philippines. America took over the last Spanish colonies and tore the last Spanish possessions from their grasp. Gold and silver as wealth had been an illusion. Spain found temporary glory in it, but they did not see that food and the products that people need and enjoy came not from gold, but from God's blessings in crops, lands, and industry. If the Spanish kings had considered gold and silver as stones, as did wise King Solomon, Spain might have founded her colonies on the real riches of the earth, instead of the heathen metal called gold. A minor historical incident in America gives additional proof of the destructiveness of gold as the base for building civilizations. Captain John Smith of Jamestown wrote a history of the colony in its early years, and he told of how some of the men found gold in one of the local streams. The other men, imbued with the dream of easy riches, left their daily work to dig for gold. They neglected their crops, and that winter the colony starved, and many died. If help had not arrived in the spring, the colony would have been abandoned. The men found out almost too late, as some of our own people may find out in the day of the Lord's wrath, that you can't eat gold, and neither can you build a society upon it. The bankers, who controlled the supply of gold of the world, and foist on the nations and on the people an illusory hope that they can stabilize the currency and the economy, have brought our Western civilization to the brink of disaster. As William Jennings Bryan charged over half a century ago, they were crucifying mankind on a cross of gold. That is enough about gold for now. I could spend hours on it, and sometime in the near future, God willing, our patriotic leaders will have to learn that gold is a curse, gold is a destroyer, and that man must consider gold, as does God, as the dust of the earth and worthless. Americans must begin to see the true wealth God has so graciously placed at our disposal, His book of wisdom, His rules for civilization, His laws in the Holy Bible, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Until next week when I return, God willing, this is Pastor Emry saying goodbye. God bless you. Read your Bibles and pray for Christian America. This is the fifth broadcast on Bible economics, God's laws and precepts on money, economics, and trade, as given in the Holy Word. I do pray most of you have heard the first parts of this series, but if not, stay with me anyway, for I can assure you God's divine law will one day become the law of this great Christian republic. Last week I spent most of the broadcast on that crazy metal called gold. The prophet Ezekiel, in the 7th chapter, writes of the time before the kingdom, and he says, in verse 19, "They shall cast their silver in the streets, and their gold shall be removed. Their silver and their gold shall not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels." Gold and silver will become so worthless men will throw it away. They will not be able to buy food with it to fill their bowels. Personally, I would guess that events which point to a worldwide famine will make food a most precious commodity, at least for a while, and when a man needs his food to survive, he of course will not sell it to another for gold, for one cannot eat gold. If you have ever read Josephus' account of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. by the Roman armies under Titus, you know inside the city they found tens of thousands of people starving to death with their gold lying around them. Isaiah also prophesies the same thing we read in Ezekiel, but he adds something else, which also seems to be coming to pass. Isaiah 2, verse 12, gives us the time when this is to happen, the day of the Lord of hosts. Then we read this in verse 19 through 21. "And they shall go into the holes of the rocks, and into the caves of the earth, for fear of the Lord, and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. In that day a man shall cast his idols of silver, and his idols of gold, which they made each one for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats, to go into the clefts of the rocks, and into the tops of the ragged rocks, for fear of the Lord, and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth." In the New Testament, Jesus spoke of this time when the earth and the heavens would be shaken, and Paul wrote of it in his letter to the Israelites, Hebrews 12, verse 25. He is, of course, writing about Jesus Christ. "See that ye refuse not him that speaketh, for if they escape not who refused him that spake on earth, much more shall not we escape, if we turn away from him that speaketh from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth," and here he is referring to God's audible voice to Israel at Mount Sinai, when it shook the whole mountain. "Whose voice then shook the earth, but now he hath promised, saying, Yet once more, I shake not the earth only, but also heaven. And this word, yet once more, signifieth that removing of those things that may be shaken, as of things that are made, that those things which cannot be shaken may remain." Verse 28, "Wherefore we, receiving a kingdom that cannot be moved, let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably, with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire." So the kingdom of Jesus Christ will be all that remains when this shaking is over. And I believe the same shaking prophesied in Isaiah 2, the shaking that will make gold and silver worthless in the earth, is the shaking prophesied in Hebrews 12. This shaking is also to happen during the invasion by Gog and Magog and all their bands into the nations of Israel, as prophesied in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Most students of prophecy recognize this Antichrist force here in Ezekiel 38 as world communism under Russia. And God, speaking of its destruction, in verse 19, "Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel." And in verse 20, "All the men that are upon the face of the earth shall shake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. Now, before we leave the subject of gold and silver and its worthlessness in the day of God's shaking of the earth, turn back again to Isaiah 2 and notice something else we read there. Verse 19, they shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth. And verse 21, they shall go into the clefts of the rocks and into the tops of the ragged rocks. I think it is significant and prophecy fulfilled that the rulers of the earth are now digging into the earth and into the rocks for protection. The American Legion magazine about a year ago reported on Red China that the major cities are digging deep into the earth to store food and survival supplies because they expect a nuclear war in the near future. Intelligence from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe reveals the Reds are digging massive bunkers and nuclear shelters under Moscow and other major cities. Miles of tunnels are being constructed under Moscow to connect with the subway for food and water storage and for survival headquarters for the Red government. Even in America, almost unknown to the citizens, huge bunkers are being built inside mountains near Washington, D.C., and in scores of other places around the United States. Some of the largest banks are storing microfilms of all of their papers and mortgages in caves in the rocks, supposedly so they can come out after the nuclear war and take your property if you or the survivors of your family cannot make the payments. I covered much of this some months ago, so won't repeat it all now, but the rulers are constructing survival shelters for themselves while they promise the people détente and peace. Anyway, I think they are fulfilling exactly what God Almighty said they would do, go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth. Some men have done this in the past, but this is the first time we have found it carried out as a major policy of the world's most powerful rulers. At the present time, they are burying their gold and silver also, but God says it will be worthless anyway. Now that is enough on gold. I said last week we would talk about what God has to say about stable money, money that does not fluctuate in value. First, the general law, and then we'll read some of the specific statutes. The law was given at Mount Sinai, Exodus 20, verse 15, the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. And verse 17, the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and so on. These, of course, are the basic laws establishing the just right of property ownership, and the divine precept that taking property from another person is stealing and covetousness. Then some specific instructions were given at the same time. Exodus 21 covers such diverse areas as a man causing injury to another is to pay for his healing and time lost from work. A man causing a miscarriage is to pay the husband damages. Persons responsible for leaving pits uncovered or wild animals loose are to pay damages for people injured, and so on. Chapter 22 covers thieves who are to restore from double to 5 times the amount they stole, man's responsibility when he takes care of another person's property. Verse 20 and 22 orders the strangers, widows, or fatherless children are not to be afflicted or oppressed. Verse 25, interest is not to be charged on money, as we have seen that is a form of stealing, and so on. And let's face it, many crimes are a form of stealing. Killing is stealing a man's life, or a woman's husband, or a child's father. Raping is stealing a woman's virginity and her honor. Bearing false witness or tale-bearing steals a man's reputation or results in other loss to him. Covetousness often leads to stealing, and on and on. So purchasing power of money is a very effective method of stealing, without the thief having to risk using a gun to do it. One simple example of how inflation steals is that it has moved many people into higher income tax brackets. They have not gained purchasing power, but the government now takes a larger percentage of their earnings, stealing it, as it were, by deceit and fraud. And we'll discuss more of that later. But anyway, at Mount Sinai, God gave the general law against theft, then statutes to implement the law, and He gave more. Turn with me to Leviticus 19, where we find God commanded Israel to have exact measurements for merchandise. Verse 35, Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in meat yard, in weight, or in measure. Just balances, just weights, a just ephah and a just hin, and those were both grain and liquid measurements. A just hin shall ye have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe all my statutes, and all my judgments, and do them. I am the Lord. And that obviously includes these statutes commanding just and exact measurements. God is not a fool, as men are. God knew it was not enough just to tell a man not to steal. God told man how to establish standards of measurement in the nation so that stealing could be prevented. Turn to Deuteronomy 25, verse 13. Thou shalt not have in thine house diverse or different measures, a great and a small, but thou shalt have a perfect and a just weight, a perfect and just measure shalt thou have. And listen to the rest of that verse. That thy days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. God says your longevity in the land shall be increased if you have specific, exact measures for the products traded in Israel. And the next verse says, For all that do such things, and all that do unrighteously, are an abomination unto the Lord thy God, meaning that all who falsify measurements, or who use different scales or grades or quantities to deceive, were doing unrighteousness, and were an abomination unto God. Proverbs 11, verse 1. A false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is His delight. Proverbs 20:23. Diverse or different, diverse weights are an abomination unto the Lord, and a false balance is not good. Today, we do understand how merchants could steal if they were allowed to change the size of the bushel, or the gallon, or the pound. You can see that. Suppose you went to a grocery store today and purchased a box of cereal labeled 1 pound. But when you weighed it at home, your scale showed it weighed 12 ounces. Imagine your consternation if you returned to the store and the manager informed you, "Oh, you have no complaint. We have changed our pound to 12 ounces. You got what you paid for. Go on home." Then suppose this could happen all over the nation. Every merchant or producer could establish whatever weight he wanted and call it a pound, or put however many inches he wanted in a yard, and sold you yard goods, and you got 12 inches of cloth for what you thought was a yard, or put it in a larger context. How about the steel manufacturer who purchased 100,000 tons of ore only to have it delivered and find the iron mine had changed their ton to 500 pounds instead of 2,000? And how about not changing the measurement itself, but just falsifying it? What if the service stations could set their pumps to register more gallons than you received, or the butcher or the feed store set their scales to read whatever they wanted. It is easy to see that trade and commerce could not function. Exact measurements, measurements known and understood by all parties, are an absolute necessity for civilized society. So much of the Mount Sinai covenant of the law has to do with property and economic justice. Some think God gave only the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, but God not only told men not to steal, He also gave them statutes and judgments so they could set up a civilization where their labor, their property, and their lives were protected, and they could live and work not only without stealing, but without allowing other men to steal from them. So civilized men long ago set exact measurements for the gram, ounce, pound, inch, foot, mile, gallon, and bushel. We even set grades, or standards of purity. Milk must have so much butter fat. 10-penny nails are all the same length. Batteries give specific voltage. Metals are graded by alloy, fineness, hardness, size, and so on. All of these set by law for the good of the people and to establish honesty and stability in trade and commerce. But this is not true of money. This is not true of money. Money, the one thing that measures all others, has its value, its purchasing power, controlled by a privately owned corporation called the Federal Reserve. The government has no control over the value of money. The Federal Reserve Corporation is owned by bankers, by those who make their fortunes in money and credit, and they set the rules and the measurements. They establish or change interest rates, terms of mortgages, and control the actual amount of money or credit available to the nation and to the government. God commanded a just weight and a just measure, one that would not and could not be used for stealing. But bankers can reduce the amount of money and credit in circulation and foreclose on 10,000 farms. They can raise interest rates and bankrupt 10,000 businesses in a year and take their property. They can withhold billions of dollars in loans to large corporations, as they did in 1929 and 1930, and put 1 million husbands and fathers out of work in 30 days. And all of this without so much as a by your leave from President, Congress, or any other level of government. Their fluctuation of the value of money makes it an unjust balance and a diverse weight, a fluctuating measurement which robs the producer and enriches the moneylender. It is a simple and yet terrifying method of stealing, not hundreds of dollars, but billions of dollars from the working people of America. God said through the prophet Amos, "They make the ephah small and the shekel great, and falsify the balances by deceit, that they may buy the poor for silver, and the needy for a pair of shoes." At no time during World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, or when America gives billions of dollars worth of military equipment to foreign governments, did the bankers who run the Fed tell the government they didn't have enough money to lend and spend. But in peacetime, the chairman of the Fed goes before Congress, protests the spending of too much money inside America for projects for the American people, and a few days later, the president cancels funds for dam and water conservation projects in 15 of the United States. Why is there always money for war, or for foreign nations, or for busing children, or for toxic vaccinations, or for nonsense, but for constructive projects to benefit the American people in the future? There is no money. Last week, I read a UPI report and an Associated Press report Both stated that the chairman of the Federal Reserve controlled all money policies, and neither the Congress nor the President had anything to say about it. President James Garfield said, quote, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce," end of quote. Where did that cancellation order for those dams in 15 states come from? Did it come from the President, or did it come from the bankers who control the amount of money and credit available to the United States? Next week, God willing, we will get into the books of the prophets on this subject of Bible economics and prophecy, and show the difference between man's current wicked system and God's future righteous one. This is Pastor Emry saying goodbye. God bless you. Read your Bible and pray for Christian America. These broadcasts are dedicated to the belief that the United States of America was intended to be, and at some time in the future will be, a Christian nation, living and working under the divine laws of the Creator God. I know that sounds visionary, but we are told in several places in God's Word that there would come a time when the earth would be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. We are told that eventually, on the earth, every knee will bow to Jesus Christ, and every tongue shall confess His rule. If we believe the Bible, that the whole world will one day be Christian, then it is obvious that America will be. This is the 6th broadcast on Bible law on money and economics, and it is possible some listeners are wondering why Pastor Emry spends so much time on the law, since so many churches pay little attention to God's law, and some actually teach it is no longer applicable in our day. Paul wrote a whole chapter on the relationship of God's law to God's grace, Romans chapter 3, and he summed it up in the last verse, "Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid, yea, we establish the law." So, faith in God through Jesus Christ is what makes us Christians, and that same faith is supposed to establish or exalt God's law. Once we are Christians, our desire to know and obey God's law should be greatly enhanced. And of course, on this program, we not only show the application of that divine principle to individuals, but to the nations. Last week we discussed God's commandments to Israel, that they were to have just weights and just measures, that they were not to use false balances and false measures to deceive or rob the people. Generally, the nations of Christendom, including America, have established an official and exact system of weights and measures. But the one most important measuring device, money, is not controlled by the government in this manner. Although our Christian founders intended this to be so, and wrote into the Constitution of the United States, Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, our Congress does not do so. Actually, the Congress of the United States has not regulated the value of money since 1863, over a century ago. Since about 1864, the privately owned bankers of the United States have controlled both the amount of money or credit available in America and have regulated the value or purchasing power of that money. In 1913, the pre-World War Congress assigned total control of the measure of money to the Federal Reserve Corporation, which is a private business owned by its member banks. Since then, the value of money has, at times, fluctuated very widely, bringing chaos, bankruptcies, and even suicide to people injured by that fluctuation. In recent years, a rapid decrease in the value of our money has wiped out a large percentage of the savings of older retired people even left some of them destitute and dependent upon relatives, government pensions, and free medicine. God told our forefathers in Israel, in Leviticus 19, verse 35, "Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in meat yard, in weight or in measure, just balances, just weights, a just ephah and a just hin shall ye have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe all my statutes and all my judgments, and do them. I am the Lord." In Deuteronomy 25, verse 13, "Thou shalt not have in thine house divers, or different, divers measures, a great and a small, but thou shalt have a perfect and a just weight. A perfect and a just measure shalt thou have." God goes on to say that anyone using different measures is committing unrighteousness and is an abomination unto the Lord thy God. Although we are quite diligent in maintaining exact measurements of physical things, and even controlling the actual makeup of foods and manufactured goods, drugs, and so on, we allow the money measure to fluctuate at the whim of the private money lenders. In that realm, we have a false balance, an unjust measure. And God tells us in Proverbs 11, "A false balance is abomination to the Lord." In just a few minutes, we will turn to the books of the prophets and the New Testament to see if God foresaw such a thing as the unjust money power ruling over his people and robbing and plundering whole nations with their accursed system of usury and debt. While you are getting your Bible to read with me, I will offer our free literature packet for March. When you write for the March packet, you will receive an excellent tract by Dr. J. Franklin Snook titled, "America Needs the Divine Law." I consider Brother Snook one of America's best informed Christians on God's laws. And in this 30-page tract, Dr. Snook has written on several subjects. He gives the law, discusses our present problems in that area, and then shows how obedience to the divine standard would correct the problem and eliminate future trouble in that area. He briefly covers the following subjects in this tract: race, capitalism, taxes, monopolies and trusts, farming, criminal law, military service, human health, foreign policy, and war. Every one of these areas is now developing into such chaos and trouble that our nation is on the verge of destruction. The race problem is an especially touchy one. Governments at various levels are hiring and promoting people according to race. Schools are assigning children to schools according to race and busing them there if it is too far to walk. Most Americans may never have heard there are laws governing race in the Bible, but there are. Here in Arizona, several Indian tribes are filing suit in federal courts asking for payment for almost all of the arable land in the state. The Phoenix newspaper recently published the map of the Indian claims. It runs from Prescott, Arizona in the north. It includes all of the Phoenix area and suburbs and the surrounding irrigated lands, then south to include Tucson, then west almost to the Colorado River. The Indians want to be paid in cash for all of that. Then their attorney stated that once that is settled, they will ask for payment for every gallon of water used by the whites since sometime in the 1800s, and they also want most of the water now flowing through Arizona canals to be set aside in the future for Indian use. These are not idle pipe dreams. These are currently being prepared and filed as lawsuits in United States District Courts. In Maine, according to Associated Press of February 28th, the United States Justice Department itself will actually file the suit in federal court to take from the whites some 12.5 million acres in Maine and turn it over to the Indians. They also want to collect $300 million from the whites and give that to the Indians as back rent and damages. And of course, the 350,000 whites now living on that land would have to either move off or make some arrangement to rent the homes or lease the farms and factories from the Indians. And by the way, that dividing up of America in an attempt to create several nations of it instead of one is prophesied in the Bible. That is not our subject this month, but God willing, I will get into that sometime in the next few weeks. Recently, the Arizona State Supreme Court handed down a decision that Arizona Indian reservations are sovereign territory, and no Arizona state or municipal laws can be enforced on the reservations. State police, county sheriffs, and city police officers are forbidden to go on the Indian reservations to make any arrests for a crime. So already, Indian reservations in Arizona have been declared sovereign territory separate from the United States. The March packet also includes a printed copy of the vision George Washington had at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777. George Washington saw three great perils which would come on America. The first vision was the Revolutionary War. Then he saw a vision of the South fighting the North and then being reunited. That was fulfilled in the Civil War. And then Washington saw America grow to the Pacific, become greatly populated, and then invaded from Asia and Africa, and a great battle fought here on this North American continent. He first told that vision a few years after 1777, probably not really understanding what he had seen. But most of it has come to pass, and the last battle is obviously upon us. You'll get a copy of that. Also a tract titled, My Minister, Is He Wrong?, our broadcaster on the book The 13th Tribe, and a summary of the great 1976 swine flu caper. In this we give proof that government doctors knew in advance this swine vaccine would paralyze people, that it would cause heart attacks, polio, sleeping sickness, the flu itself, and other diseases. And yet they went ahead and shot 40 million Americans with it anyway. I first warned against the swine flu vaccine in May of 1976. It is a great tragedy. Mass injection of disease, and now silence. The great 1976 swine flu caper. In the packet will be a list of our other literature, a catalog of over 100 Bible studies on cassette tapes, and will also send along information on how you can obtain these radio broadcasts on tape. Write to me at America's Promise, Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona, 85010. I'll give that address later. Ask for the March Free Packet. Now let us turn to some of the passages of Scripture which foretell a great Antichrist system of world rule, and we will see that its control is primarily economic. One well-known prophecy is in Revelation about something called in Revelation 17:5, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Some say this is a great religious system, and it is to some extent, but it is primarily economic. In verse 18, the angel tells John, The woman which thou sawest is that great city, which reigneth over the kings of the earth. So it doesn't just reign over the churches or over a religious system, but over governments, over the kings of the earth. Chapter 18 reveals Mystery Babylon's economic and world trade status, and its destruction is foretold. Verse 11, The merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise any more. In verse 15, it again tells of the merchants weeping, and describes them as those, quote, which were made rich by her. In verse 18, we are told they cried. In verse 19, they cried over Babylon's destruction and said, Alas, alas, that great city, wherein were made rich all that had ships in the sea, by reason of her costliness, for in 1 hour is she made desolate. Ships in the sea indicate great world trade. Already today, we have great international cartels, corporations which do business in all nations, whether they be communist or anti-communist. And those multinational trade corporations are either owned or controlled by what we would call banking families, either in America or in Europe. One example, probably better known than others, is the Rockefeller family. Chase Manhattan Bank is owned by them. Its chairman is David Rockefeller. They own large shares in petroleum companies which operate in all nations. During the Vietnam War, those multinational oil companies sold oil products to the United States, to Russia, and to North Vietnam. Their ships in the sea travel in and out of the harbors of the nations which are at war with each other, and they are not molested. During the Vietnam War, ships owned by the multinational conglomerates passed through our Panama Canal on the way to Haiphong in North Vietnam. Our military forces were under orders not to bomb or attack any of those ships, even in the harbor in North Vietnam, while they offloaded military equipment and supplies for the Reds. All were made rich that had ships in the sea, and whatever it is which is described in Revelation 17 apparently has enough control over the kings or the rulers of the earth, even over the presidents of the United States, that they gave orders that those ships were to travel unmolested even in wartime. That is not future. That has already happened, just as written in the Bible. In verse 12, 13, and 16, the merchandise of mystery Babylon is given, gold and silver and precious stones, fine linen, and right on down through a list of lesser materials, the last being lives and souls of men. No matter that the merchandise of death on those ships owned by the multinational conglomerates would be used to kill hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of Americans. They were protected by the kings of the earth, and the profits were made. That these banking and money-lending institutions operate at will inside of so-called communist countries is becoming more obvious as the years go by. Chase Manhattan Bank has offices in Moscow, as do quite a number of other New York, London, Paris, and Swiss banks, and they lend credit and money to the Red government of Soviet Russia. The United States Congress was informed that the mighty Red Empire of the USSR is indebted to New York banks to the amount of $38 billion and is raising taxes on its poor and suffering people to make the interest payments. That debt has tripled in the last few years, and some are beginning to question just who runs the Soviet Union. Is it the Red Communist Party, or is it those who advance credit or refuse it? President James A. Garfield wrote, quote, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce," end of quote. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 22 and verse 7, "The borrower is servant to the lender." The United States of America is in debt to the bankers, and the bankers control the volume of money in America. At last it is being revealed that the Soviet Union is also in debt to the bankers, and the bankers control the volume of money and credit in Russia. Are they the mystery, Babylon the Great, which rules over the kings of the earth? Type of society, religion, political system, Even war between nations has no effect on the merchants of the earth. They continue to gather wealth to themselves, whether the people are at peace or at war. Turn with me to Isaiah 10. And here is a prophecy of something that boasts in verse 13 and 14 that it has robbed the treasures of the people, and as one gathereth eggs that are left, have I gathered all the earth. Isaiah begins in verse 1. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness, which they have prescribed. Unrighteous decrees are unjust laws, laws which are in opposition to God's righteous law. Verse 2 gives the purpose of their unjust decrees: to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. The bankers' unjust system of usury and debt in America has almost destroyed the ability of the people of little talent to survive, except by some method of robbery, either direct or quasi-legal through welfare. Retired people and widows on small incomes are losing their homes and being forced to move in with relatives or into tiny apartments to survive. And the orphans are in government homes used as pawns in the game of government handouts. In verse 5, this oppressor is given a name. O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, and the staff in their hand is mine indignation. It looks as if this oppressor, this Assyrian, is something allowed to exist by God himself. For what purpose? Listen to the next verses. I will send him. In other words, God sends him. I will send him against an hypocritical nation, and against the people of my wrath will I give him a charge, to take a spoil, and to take the prey, and to tread them down like the mire in the streets. What is this? Well, quite simply, this is God allowing these Antichrist plunderers to come against God's own people because of their sin, to rob and to plunder them. In the 42nd chapter of Isaiah, God is rebuking his Israel people for their sin and iniquity, and Isaiah says in verse 22, But this is a people robbed and spoiled. They are all of them snared in holes, and they are hid in prison houses. They are for a prey, and none delivereth, for a spoil, and none saith, Restore. And we are like that. Millions of our people are losing their life savings, their homes, farms, businesses, because of confiscatory taxes and high interest or usury or outright swindles in land, stocks, and money. In verse 23, he gives the time when this would happen. Who among you will give ear to this? Who will hearken and hear for the time to come? Or the margin says, for the after time, the end of the age. Verse 24, Isaiah asks, Who gave Jacob for a spoil, and Israel to the robbers? And here is the answer. Did not the Lord, he against whom we have sinned, for they would not walk in his ways, neither were they obedient unto his law. Why is America under the economic control of the bankers? Is it only because the moneylenders are so smart and have gotten us into their clutches through debt and usury? No, it is because God has allowed it, because we have sinned against him and refuse to walk in his ways, and are not obedient unto his law. Verse 25, Therefore he hath poured upon him, upon Jacob Israel, upon him the fury of his anger, and the strength of battle, and it hath set him on fire round about, yet he knew it not, and it burned him, yet he laid it not to heart. And that is true. We are on fire. We are burned. We are being destroyed by debt, usury, even revolution and war, and we know it not, and we lay it not to heart. God is using the weather, snow, cold, rain in one place, drought and destroyed crops in another, even taking our land from us and giving it to other people. And we see not that the God who controls the wind, the nations, and the universe is speaking to our people. Well, my time is up again. Next week, God willing, we will continue on in Isaiah 10 about the Assyrian, the rod of God's anger, this Antichrist money power, which is allowed to rule over us by God because of our sin. We are His people. We are Israel, and we know it not. We seek not His word. We turn our ears from hearing His law. And the rod of the Assyrian